You are roughly a million times heavier than a housefly. You have a brain containing something like 86 billion neurons. The fly has around 100,000, a difference of nearly a million to one in your favor. You still cannot catch it. You have tried the slow approach and the fast approach. You have tried coming from behind. You have tried two hands. The fly has been sitting on the same patch of wall for 4 minutes doing nothing, and the instant your hand moves, it is gone. And by the time you have finished swinging, it has already landed somewhere else and resumed doing nothing. This is not a failure of coordination. You are losing to a creature with a brain the size of a poppy seed because that creature is running hardware specifically optimized over hundreds of millions of years for exactly this situation. Almost every part of it is faster than the equivalent part of you, and in the few places where it lacks raw speed, it compensates with better design. Let's dig into this properly because the advantages stack in a way that makes the outcome close to inevitable. Start with vision, because that is where most of the gap opens up. A fly's compound eye is built from thousands of separate units, each with its own lens and light-sensing cells, each pointing in a slightly different direction. In a housefly, there are roughly 4,000 of these per eye, and they wrap around the head to give a field of view approaching complete coverage. There is essentially no behind. A fly resting on a wall can see the hand coming from any direction without turning, which removes the single most useful tactic available to you. The trade-off is resolution. Each unit contributes something closer to a single point of brightness than a detailed image, so the fly's picture of the world is coarse, vastly worse than yours for detail. It could not read this sentence from any distance. What it has instead is temporal resolution, and this is where the real gap lies. Human vision fuses a flickering light into a steady one somewhere around 60 flashes per second, which is why screens and lights appear continuous to us. Flies do considerably better, with measurements for various species indicating flicker fusion rates several times higher than ours, and some fast-flying insects reported well beyond that. The practical consequence is that a fly's visual system samples the world far more frequently than yours does. This detail is worth sitting with directly, because of what it implies about the fly's experience of your hand. If its visual system updates several times more often than yours, then within any interval, it receives several times as many separate looks at what is happening. Time does not slow down for the fly in any physical sense, but functionally, relative to the rate at which it can perceive and act, your hand is moving through something like treacle. A swat that takes you a fifth of a second is, to the fly, an event unfolding across a great many distinct frames, with ample opportunity to determine the direction of approach and begin a response. Let's talk about which fly we are actually discussing too, because this represents a distinction that matters for the numbers involved. The order containing flies is enormous, with well over 100,000 described species and probably a great many more undescribed, and the performance varies substantially across it. The common housefly is the one most people are swatting at, and it is a competent but not exceptional performer within its own group. Fruit flies, small enough that swatting them is barely worth attempting, have been the subject of most of the detailed laboratory work because they are easy to breed and genetically tractable, and much of what is known about escape behavior and flight control comes from them. Horseflies and their relatives are considerably faster in level flight, with some estimates placing certain species among the fastest flying insects. Hoverflies specialize in extreme positional stability, holding station in moving air with a precision that looks mechanical. Then there are the predatory flies, which face the problem from the other side. Robber flies catch other insects in midair, which requires intercepting a moving target that is itself capable of evasive maneuvering, and studies of their pursuit behavior have found them using an interception strategy rather than simply chasing, adjusting course to arrive where the target will be rather than where it is. Dragonflies, which belong to a different order entirely, do the same thing with success rates in aerial hunting that have been reported above 90%, which is extraordinarily high for any predator. That last point is worth noting because it reframes the whole situation. You are not the most serious threat a fly faces. Its escape system evolved primarily against predators that are themselves fast, airborne, and specialized for catching it, and against that competition, your hand is a slow and clumsy problem it has already solved many times over. Let's talk about the response itself, too, because this represents a piece of behavior considerably more sophisticated than simple fleeing. Researchers using high-speed cameras to film flies escaping have found that they do not simply jump away from a threat. In the fraction of a second between detecting an approaching object and taking off, a fly repositions its legs, shifting its body into a posture that will launch it in the specific direction that best escapes that particular threat. The direction of the incoming object is calculated, and the pre-flight adjustment is made accordingly. The timing involved is remarkable. That planning phase has been measured at around a tenth of a second or less, and it occurs while the animal appears to be sitting still. By the time you perceive that the fly is leaving, it has already worked out where the threat is coming from, adjusted its stance, and committed to a trajectory. Work on the neural basis of this has identified specific cells that respond to looming visual stimuli. An object expanding rapidly in the visual field, which is the signature of something approaching on a collision course, and these feed into the escape circuitry directly. There is also a fast pathway that bypasses much of the processing. Flies possess large specialized neurons that carry escape signals with minimal delay, allowing an emergency takeoff at the cost of precision. The animal appears to use both systems: a rapid, less controlled escape when the threat is sudden, and a slower, better aimed one when there is a moment to prepare. Experiments varying how quickly a looming stimulus approaches have found the fly switching between these modes accordingly. Let's talk about how that visual speed is achieved too, because this represents an engineering trade-off rather than simple superiority. Speed in a visual system costs light. A photoreceptor that responds and resets very quickly has less time to gather photons for each sample, which means it needs bright conditions to work well. That is why many fast-flying insects are strongly daytime animals, and why flies become sluggish and easier to approach in dim light. The visual system that gives them their advantage is starved of the input it needs. The underlying cellular machinery differs from ours in ways that support the speed. Insect photoreceptors use a signaling cascade that recovers unusually rapidly, and the individual units of the compound eye are optically isolated from each other, so there is no waiting for a signal to resolve across a shared retina. The system is built for detecting change rather than for building a detailed picture, which suits a flying animal navigating at speed and makes it poor at the tasks vertebrate eyes are good at. Motion detection specifically has been studied for decades and became one of the founding problems of computational neuroscience. The general model involves comparing the signal from one visual unit against a slightly delayed signal from its neighbor, so that a matching pattern indicates something moving in a particular direction at a particular speed. Circuits along these lines have been identified in the fly's visual system, and the arrangement is efficient enough that direction of motion is computed within the first few processing stages, close to the eye, without anything resembling central deliberation. The information that something is moving towards the animal is effectively available almost as soon as the light arrives. Let's talk about flight too, because this represents the second half of the problem. Insect flight muscles come in two broad categories, and flies use the more remarkable one. Rather than contracting once per nerve signal, as your muscles do, their main flight muscles are asynchronous. They oscillate mechanically, driven by the elastic properties of the thorax, with the nervous system supplying only a general activation rather than timing each stroke. That arrangement decouples wing beat frequency from nerve firing rate, allowing wing beats in the hundreds per second, far faster than any nerve could command individually. Flies also have an instrument no other flying animal possesses. The hind wings have been reduced over evolutionary time into small club-shaped structures called halteres, which beat rapidly in antiphase with the wings. Because they are oscillating masses, they experience forces when the body rotates, and sensors at their bases detect those forces. Functionally, they work as gyroscopes, providing continuous, extremely fast feedback about the insect's rotation and flight. This is why a fly can be knocked sideways by a gust and recover almost instantly, and why removing the halteres experimentally leaves a fly unable to fly stably at all. The entire order to which flies belong is named for having 2 wings rather than 4, and the 2 that were given up became the guidance system. The maneuvers that result are extraordinary. High-speed filming of fruit flies has shown them executing banked turns comparable in principle to those of an aircraft, changing direction within a handful of wing beats in timescales measured in hundredths of a second. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. Some analyses have described these turns as among the fastest aerial maneuvers performed by any animal. Let's talk about landing too, because this represents a capability that seems to defy the situation entirely. Flies land on ceilings routinely, which requires arriving upside down at a surface directly overhead. Filming has revealed how it is done, and the answer varies by species and approach. Some perform a rapid roll maneuver shortly before contact. Others reach up with their front legs, make contact, and use that grip to swing the rest of the body up and over in a single motion. Either way, the whole sequence occupies a very small fraction of a second. Sticking there involves adhesive pads on the feet, which combine fine hairs with a secreted fluid that produces adhesion through surface tension and related forces. The system has to be strong enough to hold the animal against gravity and releasable instantly, which is achieved by peeling the pads off at an angle rather than pulling them straight away. The result is a creature that can settle on any surface at any orientation and depart from it faster than you can react. Let's talk about what the fly is actually detecting too, because vision is not the only channel. Flies are covered in sensory hairs sensitive to air movement, and a hand approaching at speed pushes a pressure wave ahead of it. That wave arrives before the hand does, and it provides an additional early warning that is largely independent of lighting conditions. This is the reason a slow approach sometimes works better than a fast one. A slower hand generates a weaker bow wave, even though it gives the fly more time to see it. The two effects trade off against each other, which is part of why no single swatting strategy reliably works. Flies also possess extremely sensitive chemical detection, with receptors on the antennae and, notably, on the feet, which means a fly tastes what it walks on. Their sensitivity to the compounds released by decaying material and fermentation is acute enough to draw them from considerable distances. Let's talk about the size advantage too, because this represents something more fundamental than any specific adaptation. Physics does not scale evenly. As an object gets smaller, its volume and mass fall much faster than its surface area, which changes almost everything about how it interacts with the world. For a fly, air is comparatively thick and syrupy, and its own mass is nearly negligible. That means it can accelerate to full speed almost instantaneously because there is very little inertia to overcome, and it can stop or change direction just as abruptly. Your hand, by contrast, has substantial mass, and once it is moving, it cannot alter course meaningfully. The fly is playing a game where changing direction is nearly free, against an opponent for whom it is nearly impossible. The same scaling explains why flies survive falls and impacts that would destroy a larger animal. Falling objects reach a terminal velocity determined largely by the ratio of drag to weight, and for something as small and light as a fly, that speed is low enough to be entirely survivable. A fly that hits a wall bounces off and carries on. Nervous system speed follows the same logic. Signals in a fly travel much shorter distances than in a human, and a reflex that has to cross a few millimeters will always beat one that has to cross a meter or more, regardless of how sophisticated the brain at either end is. Your visual signal has to reach the brain, be processed, and return as a motor command down the length of your arm. The fly's equivalent loop is a fraction of the length. Let's talk about why they keep coming back too, because this represents the part that makes the whole encounter so exasperating. A fly that has just escaped your hand has no strong reason to leave the area, and several reasons to stay. Houseflies are drawn to warmth, moisture, carbon dioxide, salt, and the compounds present in sweat and skin, all of which a human body produces continuously. From the fly's perspective, you are a warm, damp, chemically interesting surface, and the fact that you occasionally swing at it is a manageable cost. There is also a foraging logic to the persistence. Flies feed by regurgitating digestive fluid onto a food source, dissolving it, and drawing the liquid back up, which means they need to land on something and remain in contact with it for a while. Being repeatedly interrupted does not change the value of the resource, so the animal returns. Some species also display territorial behavior, with males holding station in particular spots and returning to them after disturbance, which is why the same fly seems to reappear in the same corner of the room indefinitely. The public health dimension is worth stating plainly, because it explains why humans have invested so much effort in this contest. Houseflies move freely between waste, decaying matter, and food, and they carry material on their bodies and in their digestive tracts. They are recognized as mechanical vectors capable of transferring pathogens associated with diarrheal disease and other conditions, and studies sampling flies in various settings have recovered a wide range of bacteria from them. The scale of that risk depends enormously on sanitation and food handling. In settings with secure waste management and covered food, the practical hazard is modest, while in settings without them, fly control is a serious public health measure rather than a matter of annoyance. Let's talk about the brain doing all this too, because this represents a real puzzle in neuroscience. A fly brain contains on the order of 100,000 neurons, and researchers have now mapped the complete wiring diagram of the fruit fly brain, every neuron and every connection between them, which is a landmark achievement and makes the fly one of the best understood nervous systems in existence. What that mapping shows is a system built for efficiency rather than generality. Dedicated circuits handle specific tasks with minimal processing overhead. Looming detection feeds almost directly into escape. Visual motion is computed by specialized detectors, and the flight control system operates as a tight feedback loop with the halteres. There is very little of the flexible, general-purpose processing that characterizes large brains, and that is precisely why it is fast. A general-purpose system considers options. A dedicated circuit does not need to. That comparison is worth holding on to. Your brain is doing something incomparably more complex than the flies, and complexity has a cost measured in time. In a contest decided entirely by reaction speed, the simpler system wins, and it is not close. Let's talk about whether the fly learns anything too, because this represents a question that turns out to have a more interesting answer than the size of the brain suggests. Flies are capable of forms of learning that were not expected from an animal with 100,000 neurons. Laboratory work with fruit flies has demonstrated associative learning, where an odor paired with an unpleasant stimulus is subsequently avoided, along with evidence of short and longer-lasting memory formation and the molecular machinery underlying it. Some experiments have reported habituation to repeated harmless stimuli, meaning a fly presented with the same non-threatening looming object repeatedly reduces its escape response over time. That last finding has an obvious practical implication and a frustrating one. A fly that has been swatted at unsuccessfully several times is not simply continuing on unchanged. There is evidence that repeated experience modifies escape behavior, and in some studies, flies became more sensitive rather than less after threatening encounters. Whether the individual fly in your kitchen is specifically wary of you is not something the research supports claiming, and the general capacity for experience to alter behavior is well established. Flies also display behaviors that look more elaborate than pure reflex. Courtship in fruit flies involves a structured sequence including a wing song produced by vibration, and it has been studied intensively as a model for how genes influence behavior. There is research on aggression, on sleep-like states with characteristics resembling sleep in larger animals, and on responses to stimuli that some researchers have argued indicate internal states affecting behavior across time rather than moment-to-moment reaction. How far any of that extends toward anything resembling experience is contested and probably unanswerable with current methods. And the observation that a very small nervous system supports a considerably richer behavioral repertoire than expected is not in dispute. Let's talk about how to actually catch one too, because the biology suggests a strategy. Since the fly repositions to jump away from where it detects the threat, and since it usually launches upward and backward relative to the approach, aiming at where the fly is currently sitting is aiming at where it will not be. Aiming slightly ahead of it in the direction it is likely to escape toward improves the odds considerably. Approaching from directly above reduces the escape options available, and the classic two-handed approach works on the same principle by covering more than one exit. Reducing the air disturbance helps as well, which is part of why swatters are perforated. And a cold fly is a slow fly, since insect nervous systems and muscles are temperature dependent, which is why flies in a cool room are noticeably easier to catch than the same species on a hot afternoon. Let's talk about how old this problem is too, because this represents the reason the fly is so well equipped for a threat that only recently included hands. Insects were flying long before anything else was. The fossil record puts winged insects in the air by around 320 million years ago, tens of millions of years before the first vertebrate got off the ground. And for a long stretch, they had the sky entirely to themselves. Some of the insects from that era were enormous by modern standards, with dragonfly relatives reaching wingspans comparable to a large bird, generally attributed to higher atmospheric oxygen levels at the time. The arms race began once things started eating them. Flying insect predators came first, then pterosaurs, then birds, then bats, and each edition applied new pressure. Bats are the most instructive case because they hunt using echolocation at night, and the insect response to that was to evolve hearing tuned to bat calls. Several groups independently developed ears sensitive to ultrasound, along with evasive behaviors triggered by detecting it. Sudden dives, erratic looping, or simply folding the wings and dropping. Some moths produce ultrasonic clicks of their own, which appear to jam or startle the hunting bat. Flies specifically emerged as a group somewhere around 250 million years ago, and their defining innovation, converting the hind wings into halteres, traded raw lift for control. That was a substantial bet, and it paid off. The group became one of the most successful on the planet, occupying nearly every terrestrial and freshwater habitat and evolving into forms ranging from blood feeders to pollinators to parasites to predators. The escape response you keep losing to was shaped by that entire history. It is not a response to humans. It is a general-purpose solution to being small, edible, and hunted from every direction by things considerably better at it than you are. Let's talk about what we have built from studying them too, because this represents the practical payoff of a great deal of the research described here. Flies have become one of the most heavily used model organisms in biology, and the reasons are pragmatic. They breed quickly, are cheap to maintain in large numbers, have a modest genome that was sequenced early, and can be genetically manipulated with a precision that few animals allow. Substantial share of what is known about how genes control development came from fruit fly work, including the discovery of the gene families that establish body layout in animals generally, findings that turned out to apply across the animal kingdom, including to us. The flight and vision research has fed directly into engineering. Small aerial robots face exactly the problems a fly solved: staying stable in turbulent air, navigating without heavy sensors, and reacting faster than any deliberative system could manage. And designers have borrowed extensively. Artificial gyroscopic sensors modeled on halteres have been built and tested. Vision systems based on insect motion detection circuits have been developed for obstacle avoidance. And they are attractive precisely because they are computationally cheap. A system that detects looming without reconstructing a full scene needs a fraction of the processing power. There is a broader lesson embedded in that. For decades, the assumption ran that better performance required more computation, and the fly is a standing argument against it. A tightly specialized circuit that does one thing extremely fast beats a general system that does everything slowly in any contest where timing decides the outcome. Engineers building small autonomous machines have converged on the same conclusion the fly arrived at through natural selection. Let's zoom out and pull all of these different threads together. A fly is difficult to catch because nearly every relevant advantage belongs to it. Its compound eyes provide near-complete visual coverage, removing any blind approach. Its visual system samples the world several times faster than yours, so your fastest movement arrives as a leisurely sequence of frames. Within 1/10 of a second of detecting a threat, it calculates the direction of approach and repositions its legs to launch away from it. Its flight muscles oscillate faster than nerves can fire, and modified hind wings act as gyroscopes, providing near-instant stability feedback. Sensory hairs detect the pressure wave your hand pushes ahead of itself, and because it is small, it has almost no inertia, so changing direction costs it nothing while costing you everything. Underneath all of it is the scaling argument. Being tiny means shorter nerve pathways, negligible mass, and a physical environment that behaves differently. The fly is not outthinking you. It is operating on a timescale where thinking, in the sense you do it, is far too slow to matter. Which leaves an interesting thought worth sitting with. The thing sitting on your wall has been refining this exact escape for longer than mammals have existed, and every fly that failed at it left no descendants. which means the one in your kitchen is the current output of a filter that has been running without a single pause for 250 million years.